Hello friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Kicking off today's video is a story about a tenant who finally stopped compensating for a letting agency's incompetence, exposing how little authority means when you can't even unlock the door. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with a turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. They threatened legal entry without bringing the keys. I'm renting an apartment from a property management company whose letting agents somehow managed to be unprofessional, late, and slow all at the same time. Over the course of about 10 months, I've dealt with missed appointments, contradictory emails, surprise visits, and an impressive inability to communicate internally. But all of that's background noise compared to what happened when I finally told them I'd be moving out. Once I gave notice, the landlord instructed their agents to start arranging viewings for new tenants. The process was supposed to be simple. The agent would email me with a proposed date and time, and I'd confirm whether I could be home. I was very clear about one thing from the beginning. I have a cat, and I insisted on being present during every viewing. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I just didn't want strangers wandering around my home unsupervised with a nervous animal inside. Here's where the fun part comes in. The agents never had keys. Apparently, the landlord's office is on the opposite side of the city, and the agents couldn't be bothered to pick up keys for each viewing. Instead, they relied entirely on me to let them in every single time. It was lazy, but I went along with it to keep the peace. Most viewings went smoothly, aside from a couple of surprise appearances where they showed up unannounced, peeked inside, and later sent passive-aggressive emails about the apartment not being presentable. You know, the usual nonsense. Then, about a week ago, one agent emailed me saying she'd scheduled a viewing for the 13th. I replied promptly, explaining that I'd be at work that day and wouldn't be available. Instead of suggesting an alternative time, she fired back with, "If you won't be able to accommodate this request, I'll ask the landlord for a 24-hour notice of entry, which is legally enforceable." Fine, go ahead. The day of the viewing arrives. I'm at work when my phone rings. We're downstairs. I paused, then said, "Congratulations, I'm not home. I hope you brought keys this time." Silence. Then confusion. Then irritation. We went back and forth for a few minutes. She tried to threaten me with legal action, claiming I was obstructing a lawful entry. I calmly pointed out that I had never refused entry. They were free to enter. They just hadn't bothered to bring the means to do so. Their inability to access the apartment was entirely due to their own negligence, not mine. There wasn't much she could say to that. Later that evening, I received an email from the landlord asking me to be more cooperative with future viewings. I didn't bother replying. After 10 months of accommodating their disorganization, I was done being their unpaid doorman. If they want access to their property, they can start by carrying keys like every other functioning adult in property management. You were exactly as cooperative as you could be. You said you weren't in, you said you couldn't be in, you agreed that with 24 hours notice the landlord could require entry. It doesn't require you to be there to let them in. And our second story. Correcting my every move? Oops, this is on you. Back in the early 90s, I worked in graphic design. I took a job with a small agency, now defunct, and was supposed to be the creative director. Soon after joining, I learned that I was fed a line of bullcrap and that actually I was considered an entry-level designer. This after having my portfolio reviewed with videos of commercials, tapes of radio stuff, entire campaigns written and concepted by me, etc. But nope, you're entry-level now. Well, I needed the job desperately and was told your first 3 months are probation, after that you'll get larger duties. Well, okay, we'll see how this goes. I had rent and a car payment, so not a lot of choices and nobody was hiring. During that idiotic probation, the guy I was replacing was still there for a month. I know, to oversee the transition. Seriously, folks, transition over maybe 5 accounts that weren't that busy, but whatever. Not to mention my 15 years in the biz, and this guy only had 2 years. But I digress. This guy, let's call him Jay, because that's his name, was a really freaky dude. He looked like an alien and acted like a robot. Zero emotions, barely moved his face when he talked, never laughed, and most importantly, not creative at all. And a real B-turd when it came to all the silly rules and regulations of this tiny 5-person agency. Basically, a real pain in the butt. But I did my best to do what he wanted, knowing he'd be, thankfully, gone soon. Within the first month, I was given an assignment of designing a pocket folder with inserts. Very standard stuff. Instead of the standard vertically tabbed inserts, however, the client wanted them to be stepped, meaning that each insert gets shorter and shorter as it gets to the front of the pocket for a stepped look. A hassle, but nothing that difficult. For a couple of days, I'm getting the measurements right, making sure this rough is totally perfect because Jay picked out all my colors, fonts, etc., and getting them approved by my incredibly hands-on agency owner. An entire novel could be written about this, but that's for another sub. So now that the rough idea has been approved by the client, the next week I'm creating the actual files for the job to be printed from. I got all the portions correct, it's just waiting for the final text from the client and I'll be all done. Please note that this is an ad agency and every minute of our time is recorded on time cards as to what we're doing and what client it's for. We're not allowed to even fudge on this card no matter what, even if it's just us correcting our own errors or whatever. And per Jay, we're supposed to supply details on each portion, down to even putting down the minutes for our filling out the time card. Yes, idiotic, but there you have it. I come in the next morning and there's Jay. He's sitting at my computer and on the screen is my folder job, so I casually sit down in the adjacent chair and say, "Hey Jay, what's up?" Jay doesn't turn to me or look at me, he just states with a robotic yet irritated voice, "I have spent the last 2 hours going over this folder job and correcting your incredibly stupid errors. The sizing of these inserts is all over the place, and this is incredibly sloppy work. I don't know why this place even hired you." So I'm barely able to contain my laughter, but say, Jay, that's interesting. Wait for a beat. Did you read the job folder description? Because those inserts are supposed to be stepped down in size for each one. It took me about 2 hours to get that just right. I certainly hope you didn't change all of them because your time will have to be explained, and then per your instructions, I'll have to write down on my time card who messed them up and why I had to do them all over again. I watched the back of Jay's head, who was now frozen in place and not moving. His ears slowly turned bright red. "Well, Jay, you better get out of my chair because I'm going to have to get busy and change them all back, and that's going to take a while. Oh, and Jay, make sure you put down on your time card the hours you spent this morning on this job and explain them so I don't get in trouble for going over the budgeted hours." Jay slowly got up from the chair and walked out. What poor young Jay didn't know is that I had a secret file of backups and it wouldn't take me that long at all. But I was going to sit at that computer and pretend to be working on that job for the rest of the day while talking on the phone to my friends. And I'd be sure to mark down all the time it would have taken to fix young Jay's mistakes with a very detailed explanation for my hours per Jay's instruction. I left that horribly run agency within a few months to start my own design business. It was the last time I ever worked for someone else. I retired last year after 25 years owning my own business, but I'll always remember Jay and laugh. Thanks for the laughs, Jay. And our last story. A greedy landlord evicted my family to flip our house, then he lost everything. I grew up in a neighborhood most people only ever talked about from a distance. It sat wedged between aging apartment blocks, a polluted river that smelled worse when the tide was low, and two highways that never really slept. It was loud, crowded, and rough around the edges, but it was home. The people there didn't have much patience for outsiders, and being one of the few white families in the area meant we caught our share of hostility growing up. Still, it was a place with rules of its own. And once you proved you belonged, the neighborhood protected you fiercely. At the center of everything was the community center. It wasn't fancy, but it was sacred ground in its own way. The director ran it with a calm authority that bordered on reverence. People listened when she spoke. She wasn't loud or intimidating. She was precise, fair, and impossible to bully. I never once saw her act without principle, and when disputes happened, they usually ended the moment she got involved. Our landlord was the opposite of what you'd expect from someone renting in that neighborhood. She was older, soft-spoken, and endlessly kind. She knew our house was more than my parents could realistically afford, and she worked around it. If someone was struggling, she'd find them small repair or maintenance jobs and quietly deduct more than the fair value from their rent. It kept families housed who otherwise wouldn't have been able to stay. Looking back, it was probably illegal, but it kept people fed and stable. When she passed away suddenly, the entire neighborhood felt it. Her sons inherited the properties and quickly realized they didn't want anything to do with being landlords. They couldn't understand how the books balanced, and rather than learn, they started selling everything off. I don't blame them for that. What I blame is the man who bought our house. He didn't waste a single day reminding us that he wasn't like the woman who came before him. The rent was raised immediately to current market rates. Then came the rules. No partial payments, no extensions, no work in exchange, full rent on the first of the month or an eviction notice on the second. My parents drained what little savings they had just trying to stay afloat. At the same time, the city approved a large-scale revitalization project for the neighborhood. Streets were being rebuilt, pipes replaced, fences fixed, facades repainted. It was a long overdue effort, and the community director had fought hard to get it approved. The work moved block by block, slowly inching closer to our street. The new landlord noticed. He began showing up constantly, inspections that found nothing, complaints about trivial issues, accusations that bordered on absurd. At one point, he tried to accuse my parents of animal abuse after our cat was mauled by a wild animal, claiming we had done it ourselves. Even the vet shut that down immediately. It was obvious what he wanted. He wanted us gone so he could renovate and flip the house once the city work reached our street. Eventually, we started preparing to leave. Most of the family moved out first, staying with my older brother several hours away. One of my brothers stayed behind because of work and friends, convinced he could keep up with the rent on his own if he cut corners hard enough. He almost managed it. Almost. 1 month he came up $20 short. That was all it took. The eviction notice came fast. We made the trip back to collect the last of our belongings. The neighborhood knew what was happening. For the first time in my life, no one stared. No one commented. No one made things harder. People nodded. People helped. They understood what eviction meant. The landlord tried to push us out early, ignoring the notice period entirely. That was when the community center director stepped in. She didn't argue with him directly. She went to the housing office and flagged procedural issues in the eviction notice and the timing, especially considering the property was still classified as an active rental within a city revitalization zone. That triggered a review, which legally paused enforcement. It didn't save us, but it bought us a few days the landlord hadn't planned for. He was furious. By the time we left for good, we were still technically entitled to a few more days. It didn't matter. When we drove past the house one last time, work crews were already throwing our remaining belongings into a dumpster. What happened next? I didn't see firsthand. I learned it later, piece by piece. The landlord moved into the house himself. The logic was simple. Owner-occupied homes were eligible for full renovation coverage under the city project. He assumed living there, even briefly, would qualify him. It didn't. The community director shut that down immediately. At the time the project was approved, the property was listed as a rental. The funding was allocated accordingly, and the partial coverage was tied to the former tenant, not the new owner. He was eligible for nothing. Worse, city regulations required him to renovate the exterior at his own expense to match the rest of the neighborhood. He did it cheaply. New carpet, paint, cosmetic fixes, corners cut everywhere. Then he tried to sell. The neighborhood remembered him. Every showing was disrupted. Not violently, just persistently. Noise complaints, prospective buyers asking around and getting cold, honest answers. The house sat. The price dropped, then dropped again. When a buyer finally bit, the community director ensured the paperwork was flawless. Every inspection, every permit, every requirement enforced to the letter. That's when the black mold was found. Somewhere during his rushed renovations, he damaged the pipes. Moisture had been sitting inside the walls for months. The inspectors flagged it immediately. Remediation would have been expensive, but possible if he'd known in time. He didn't. By the time the information reached him, deadlines had passed, the sale collapsed, the city condemned the house days later. The neighborhood didn't stop there. Complaints were filed, violations stacked up, the city ordered demolition, and because of the circumstances, the cost fell entirely on him. The house was torn down. He tried to force a family out to make quick money. Instead, he spent a year fighting legal battles, lost the property, and paid tens of thousands out of pocket. The community center still stands, and the neighborhood still remembers who protected it and who tried to exploit it. There's something powerful about the ending not being triumphant, but quiet. The house didn't become someone else's success story. It didn't get flipped. It didn't get redeemed. It simply disappeared, and the neighborhood stayed. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.